Burbank, California, October 14th, 1971. The Tonight Show. 11 minutes into the broadcast, with 15 million Americans watching on live television, Lieutenant Colonel James Garrett leaned forward in his chair, pointed his finger directly at John Wayne's face, and said words that no one on that stage or in that country had ever expected to hear out loud. You've never worn a uniform in your life. You've made millions playing soldiers and heroes, and every man who actually fought, every man who actually bled, knows exactly what you are. You're a fraud. For a moment, no one moved. Ed McMahon's smile disappeared so fast, it looked like someone had switched off a light. Johnny Carson set his coffee mug down on the desk, slow, deliberate, the way a man moves when he's afraid that any sudden sound might detonate something. The studio audience, 230 people who had been laughing 30 seconds ago, went absolutely silent. Somewhere in the back row, a woman audibly gasped. John Wayne sat perfectly still, 64 years old, one lung already removed. A man who had spent 40 years building the image of unshakable American strength, and he did not flinch. He did not look away. He turned his head toward Garrett slowly, the way a mountain turns toward weather, and he looked at that pointing finger, and then he looked at the man behind it. The medals on Garrett's chest, the combat patch on his left shoulder, the particular kind of stillness that only lives in men who've been truly afraid and kept moving anyway. The audience didn't know whether to boo or hold their breath. Carson didn't know whether to cut to commercial. Garrett didn't lower his hand. And in that frozen moment, in that single suspended second of live American television, nobody in that studio knew that John Wayne had something in his breast pocket, a letter he had been carrying for 3 years, a letter he had never shown anyone, a letter written by a mother whose son had died in Vietnam, and whose last words on this earth had been about the man now sitting in silence while a soldier called him a coward. But that moment didn't start there. If you've ever judged someone before you knew the whole story, stay with me, drop a comment below, and keep watching. James Garrett didn't walk onto that Tonight Show stage by accident. He came with a purpose, and that purpose had been building inside him for 22 years. Born in Macon, Georgia, 1931, the second son of a railroad worker who believed in two things: hard work and harder silence. Garrett enlisted at 19, the same week his high school graduation photo was taken. Korea came first, then a decade of peacetime deployments that felt like waiting for a war nobody wanted to name. Then Vietnam. 2 full tours. The kind of service that doesn't make newspapers because the men doing it are too busy surviving to write letters home. By 1971, Garrett had 3 Purple Hearts, a limp in his left knee from a mortar round outside Hugh City in 1968, and 22 years of his life given to a country that was, at that exact moment, deeply unsure whether it was proud of the men it had sent to fight. He had watched friends come home to protests. He had watched a government argue over the value of a war, while the men bleeding in it had no choice but to keep bleeding. And through all of it, through Korea and Vietnam, and every cold base and every field hospital and every flag-draped coffin, he had watched John Wayne. Every war film, every heroic speech, every scene of cinematic courage delivered by a man who had draft-deferred his way through World War II, while real men his age crossed real beaches under real fire. To Garrett, it wasn't entertainment. It was an insult dressed in a costume. Each Wayne film felt like a hand reaching into the chest of every combat veteran and rearranging what was there to make it prettier for people who would never understand it. The breaking point came in 1968. Garrett was recovering from his knee wound in a military hospital outside Saigon when a nurse wheeled in a television set. The Green Berets was playing, John Wayne's Vietnam film, released that summer. Around him, men with missing limbs watched a movie star play the war they were still inside. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. Garrett requested the Tonight Show appearance the week he learned Wayne would be a guest. His commanding officer asked him twice if he was certain. Both times, Garrett said yes. He had been certain for 3 years. But what Garrett didn't know, what no one had told him, was what John Wayne had been doing in private, away from every camera, for the exact same 3 years. The guilt was real. It had always been real. And John Wayne had carried it the way certain men carry their worst truths, silently, completely, and without ever letting it show on their face. His real name was Marion Morrison, born in Winterset, Iowa, 1907. By 1942, he was 34 years old, already a working film star, and watching the country he loved go to war without him. He applied for a military deferment to finish a film contract. The paperwork went through. He reapplied for active service. Was deferred again. 4 children, essential industry worker, age bracket. By the time every door had closed, the men who would have served alongside him were already in the Pacific, already in North Africa, already dying in places whose names he would later read in newspapers on a California film set. He never talked about it publicly. Wayne understood something about the weight of certain admissions, that some truths, spoken aloud, don't free a man. They just transfer the burden to everyone listening. So he kept it inside, and he worked. He played soldiers and lawmen and heroes, not because it was profitable, though it was, but because it was the only form of penance available to him. Every uniform he wore on screen was an apology he couldn't say out loud. In 1953, he flew to Korea to visit troops. In 1966, he flew into Vietnam, active combat zones, field hospitals, forward operating bases. His publicist begged him not to go. Wayne went anyway. At a field hospital outside Da Nang, he sat with a 19-year-old corporal named Danny Reyes, both legs gone below the knee. Reyes had carried a worn copy of The Sands of Iwo Jima through 2 tours in his pack. He asked Wayne to sign it. They talked for 40 minutes, not about movies, about home, about Reyes' mother in Corpus Christi, about what he planned to do when he got back. 3 weeks later, Danny Reyes died of infection. 7 months after that, a letter arrived at Wayne's production office from Reyes' mother. Wayne read it once, folded it, and put it in his breast pocket. He had carried it every single day for 3 years. He was carrying it the night Garrett pointed his finger and called him a fraud. If this story is already hitting you, subscribe and don't move. The next part changes everything. Wayne turned toward Garrett slowly. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the overhead lights was audible. Carson hadn't spoken. McMahon hadn't moved. The audience sat in that particular collective stillness that only arrives when people sense they are witnessing something that cannot be undone. Wayne's voice, when it came, was not what anyone expected. "You're right about one thing, Colonel. I didn't serve. And that's a fact I've lived with every single day for 30 years. The audience murmured. Garrett's finger came down, not because he was backing away, but because something in the room had shifted, the way air shifts before weather arrives, and his body registered it before his mind did. Wayne didn't raise his voice, didn't perform, didn't reach for the charm that had carried him through 40 years of Hollywood. He spoke the way men speak when they have stopped caring how they sound and started caring only about whether what they're saying is true. He talked about 1942, the deferment, the reapplication, the second deferment. He said plainly, without decoration, "I was a coward about it. Men younger than me died, and I was on a film set in California. I know exactly what that makes me." Then he reached into his breast pocket and took out the letter. He told Garrett about Danny Reyes, the field hospital outside Da Nang, the worn copy of The Sands of Iwo Jima, the 40 minutes they talked about home. He told it plainly, the way you tell something true. No pauses for effect, no careful word choices, just the facts in the order they happened. And then he unfolded the letter, and he read the part that Reyes's mother had written about her son's last words, that Wayne had sat with him and treated him like a man, not a charity case, not a photo opportunity, like a man. Wayne held the letter out toward Garrett. Garrett stared at it. His jaw was working. Both hands were in his lap now, very still. He took the letter, read it. The camera caught his face, and the whole country saw the exact moment a man's certainty breaks open and something raw comes through. He looked up. His voice was completely different from the man who had spoken 60 seconds ago. Why didn't you ever say any of this? Publicly. Wayne looked at him steadily. Because it wasn't about me. Garrett extended his hand. Wayne shook it. The audience erupted. Carson exhaled so visibly that McMahon laughed. The real laugh, not the broadcast one. And nobody in that studio said a single word about what had just happened, because some moments are too large for commentary. The cameras stopped rolling at 12:03 a.m. The audience filed out slowly, the way people leave church when the service has genuinely moved them, quietly, not quite ready to return to ordinary life. Carson shook Wayne's hand at the desk, said something low that nobody heard. Wayne nodded once. Garrett found him in the green room at 12:11 a.m. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open, stepped inside, and stood there for a moment in the doorway. Decorated soldier, 2 tours, 22 years, looking at a 64-year-old man in a gray suit who was sitting alone on a vinyl couch with the letter folded back in his breast pocket. Wayne looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Garrett pulled the chair from the makeup table, set it directly in front of Wayne, and sat down. They talked for 40 minutes. No cameras, no publicist, no audience of 15 million. Garrett talked about Hugh City, the mortar round, the 3 men he had carried out of the fire that night in 1968, dragging them one by one across 80 yards of open ground, while everything above him was noise and heat, and the specific kind of prayer that isn't words. Wayne listened without interrupting, didn't reach for a parallel, didn't try to relate it to a film. Just listened with the complete attention of a man who understands that some stories require nothing from the listener, except their full presence. When Garrett finished, Wayne asked one question. Did they make it? Garrett said, 2 of them. Wayne nodded, said nothing. That silence held more weight than any response. The next morning, Garrett made 2 phone calls. The first was to his wife. The second was to the Veterans Advocacy Organization he chaired. He got Wayne's contact through the Carson production office and wrote him a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, apologizing for the public accusation and asking if Wayne would speak at the organization's annual dinner in Washington, D.C. the following February. Wayne accepted the same day. No fee, paid his own travel. Told his publicist it wasn't a public appearance. It was a private obligation. The dinner was February 19th, 1972. 400 combat veterans in a ballroom in Washington. Wayne stood at the podium with no script, no notes, and no performance left in him whatsoever. And what he said next silenced every man in that room for 8 full seconds. If this story is moving you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe. There are more of these waiting. Wayne stood at that podium in Washington and told the truth. Not the Hollywood version, not the carefully managed public image that 40 years of stardom had built and polished and protected. The plain, undecorated truth about a man who had wanted to serve, failed to serve, and spent every year since trying to honor the men who had done what he could not. He talked about Danny Reyes, about the field hospital, about a 19-year-old boy with no legs who had carried a worn movie poster through 2 tours of Vietnam because it made him feel less alone in the dark. He didn't perform it. He told it the way Garrett had told him about Hue City, flatly, in order, without pausing for effect. When he finished, there was no applause for 8 full seconds. The room was absolutely still. Then every man stood. 400 combat veterans, some with canes, some with prosthetics, some carrying wounds that would never fully close, every one of them on their feet. Not for a movie star, for a man who had told the truth about his own failure and shown up anyway. Garrett was in the front row. He stood first. 7 years later, in 1979, the cancer came back. Stomach this time. The lung was already gone. Wayne was 71 years old, and the body that had carried 40 years of films and guilt and penance was finally, quietly, running out of road. Garrett flew to Los Angeles when he heard, sat with Wayne for 3 days in the house in Newport Beach. They watched old westerns together. Not Wayne's films, the cheap B pictures from the 1930s, the ones he made for $75 a week before anyone knew his name. Wayne laughed at the young man on screen, the one who didn't know yet what any of it would cost. On the second evening, Garrett asked him, was it worth it? All of it? Wayne was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that isn't avoiding the question, but actually answering it. Then he said, ask the men who came home. If they say yes, then yes. John Wayne died June 11th, 1979. He was 72 years old. Among the private messages read at his funeral was a letter from Lieutenant Colonel James Garrett. It said, he never wore a uniform, but he understood duty better than most men who did. Most people who have seen that Tonight Show clip remember only the first 30 seconds. The pointed finger, the word fraud, the frozen studio. They share it as a moment of confrontation, a soldier putting a movie star in his place, and they move on without ever knowing what came after. They don't know about the green room, the 40 minutes, the 3 pages of handwritten apology. They don't know about the Washington dinner or the 8 seconds of silence before 400 broken men stood up at once. They don't know that James Garrett, the man who came to that studio to publicly destroy John Wayne, spent the last years of his life calling him one of the finest Americans he ever knew. And they don't know what Garrett did the day Wayne was buried. He drove to the cemetery alone. No press, no ceremony, no one watching. He stood at the grave in his full dress uniform, the one he wore for funerals of men he considered worth the honor. He stood at attention, and he saluted. Held it for a long moment in the California morning air. This old soldier with a bad knee and 30 years of hard history, saluting a man who never served a single day in uniform. Nobody asked him to, nobody photographed it, nobody ever reported it. He did it because it was true. That is the part of the story the cameras always miss. Not the confrontation, the conversion. Not the attack, the answer. 2 men, 1 stage, 1 letter. And the moment a war hero learned that honor is not a uniform, it is a choice a man makes every day, sometimes in public, and sometimes standing alone at a grave, with no one watching. John Wayne made that choice, every single day, for 30 years. What do you think? Did he earn that salute? Tell me in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe, because these are the stories worth keeping alive.